Recording, and we're all set. So we're good. So good morning, everybody, and thank you for waking up on a Saturday morning to be with us. And so this is obviously not a typical meeting, community and board members. So my name is Dr. Michael Burke, and I'm chairman of Community Board 12. And so what we're here to do today is to really learn more about zoning and how the Department of City Planning works with the Department of Housing Preservation and Development and how that affects our neighborhood. So, over the past couple of years, we've seen a lot of development take place, and we've also seen a lot of zoning um, that kind of sort of facilitates that. And so a lot of you ask questions, well, why is this happening? What can we do? Not say to stop it per se, but what can we do? How do we learn about this? And so what normally happens is that the Department of City Planning normally has training sessions. And of course, I've attended some. And of course, you've seen me with this particular handbook. Now, this handbook has been given out to every single board member. And for those of you that are members of the community, you can find it on their website. But still, not everybody is up to speed with how zoning works and how housing preservation and development works. And so for months, we've been talking about this. A district manager presented an idea to me, which I thought was a fantastic idea, is what could we do to get our board not only up to speed, but teach the board and the community about how these two agencies work together. So, we've been working on this. And so I'm proud to say that everybody's here. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the agency leads, and I'm going to have them introduce their people. And then from there, we're going to have a presentation. What I ask of each and every board member and member of the community is that you hold your questions to the end. Some of the questions that we have proposed to them already are going to be hopefully answered in the presentation. And so, again, that list of questions was sent out to you earlier. So you should have them already. So some of those questions will hopefully be answered. But if you have any questions that arise from the presentation, I'm going to ask you to hold that for the Q&A period, which will take place around 11:15. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the two main agency heads, and then I'm going to have them introduce their people. So the Bronx Borough Director for the Department of City Planning is Ms. Carol Samo, and the Bronx Director for the Department of Housing and Development is Mr. Ted Weinstein. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Ms. Samo, and welcome to Community Board 12.
Thank you, Dr. Burke. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see everyone, even if it's virtually. I'm Carol Sammel, and I'm the director of the Bronx office of the Department of City Planning. I want to say a little word about city planning and then introduce the team who will be presenting to you today. I would say a few words that, city planning has worked over the many years, at least since I've been at city planning, pretty closely with Board 12, doing various rezonings and neighborhood, analyses to understand the needs of your various communities across the district. And in fact, I think we've touched upon just about every corner of Community Board 12. And we're happy to present a little bit of information about, well, what's been happening since all of this work has transpired. And some of you may remember we met with you to talk about Boston Road not long ago, although with 2020, it's been a couple of years ago now. Our job is in part, not only is city planning the land use agency for the city, but we provide technical assistance to the community boards. And our liaison to Community Board 12, I'll start with introducing him, which many of you probably already know, Manny Lagares. Manny, can you give a wave there and say hello? And we have with us, so Manny joins many of your meetings and serves as a liaison with the department, really kind of sharing on the ground information from you all with the agency to understand what your needs are, and also citywide issues, bringing them to you all, which I think you all are hearing a few right now. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce the rest of the team. Sean Brady, who's the Deputy Director at the Bronx Office of City Planning. He'll be doing some presenting this morning. as well as Justin Lamorella, who will also be presenting to you. And Fernando Ortiz, he's here. There he is. There's Fernando. One of our newest members joined us during the pandemic. So welcome, Fernando. And so that, without further ado, I will turn it over. We're glad to continue the conversation. This will definitely be more than one conversation, and happy to be here with HPD to start it, and turn it over to Ted Weinstein from HPD. No, Ted, we can't hear you. Sorry.
Okay. All right. Sorry about that. Thank you, Carol. Good morning, Dr. Burke. Good morning, members of Community Board 12. We're happy to be with you. My name is Ted Weinstein. I'm the HPD Director of Bronx Planning. And you have with you this morning my entire unit. Winnie Campbell, who's the Deputy Director for Bronx Planning, and Kay Reel and Lena Saad, who are both senior planners with our unit. And you'll be seeing a presentation a little bit later this morning. All the credit for that goes basically to Kay and to Lena, who put it together. Let me just say very quickly that, we cover the entire Bronx, our unit. We've not done nearly as much work in your board as we have in areas of the South Bronx. But for what we have done and what will be done in the future, we welcome this opportunity. We want people to know what we do and why we do it and how we do it. And so we're more than happy to have this presentation. You're going to be getting a lot of information this morning. First, a lot from city planning, and then a lot from us. But you'll have these presentations as well as references. But hopefully what you'll leave this morning is you'll have a better understanding of how zoning happens from city planning and what it means, and then from us, what HPD does, and even more so in terms of affordable housing, what are the processes and the policies. So again, thank you for the opportunity, and we hope that you enjoy the show.
Great.
Okay, so thank you, Ms. Seymour and Mr. Weinstein. So I guess who is going first? Is city planning going first?
That would make sense.
Okay.
Great. And I think Fernando is going to share screen, and then we're going to start off. Here we go. Good. Perfect. And so next slide, you'll probably get sick of hearing me say next slide, but this is the world we live in. So good morning again, and thank you all again for taking this nice spring Saturday afternoon to have this discussion. We're always excited to talk to the community boards and to be able to do it again in person. Again, I'm Sean Brady. I'm the Deputy Director for our Bronx office at City Planning. Just a quick overview of the presentation, and then we'll get right into it. As Ted alluded to, a lot of information. Going to talk a little bit about city planning and our role in the city, and then about what zoning is, how it works, and then I'm going to pass it over to Justin, who's going to talk through some development and rezoning specific to Community Board 12, and then we'll pass it over to HPD and then get into Q&A. We're going to ask that you hold questions until the end, and we'll make sure to answer all questions, even if they're in the chat and we have to get to them later. We will cover everything. So next slide. And next slide. Great. Just a little bit about our agency. Our overall objectives are quite broad. Of course, we work in neighborhoods doing long-term neighborhood planning. You'll see a little bit today about how we work closely with HPD around housing and with communities to understand where housing should go. We look at things like resiliency. You've seen some of our work on the recent zoning for coastal flood resiliency text that came through. We also do other studies around that. Of course, land use, we're going to speak a little bit to zoning today. And data. Many of you have seen maybe our community portal with some great information there. Justin's going to share some additional data today. So it's a broad range of things that city planning works on. Next slide. This is a bit of a complex looking diagram, but I think really what we want to show is that we're coordinating with stakeholders across the city on all our efforts, whether it's in conversations like this, whether it's with the City Planning Commission, where our chair is the chair, whether it's us as a mayoral agency to understand how administrative priorities fit into our planning objectives, or with city agencies or elected officials. Whenever we're talking about land use, it's our job to be a facilitator and conversation starter when we're talking to other stakeholders. We're often the conduits for community boards when we're dealing with stakeholders during a planning process. Next slide. And we're engaged in all types of planning efforts that reflect this. We recently released a report, an update on storefront vacancy, coordinating closely with small business services. Again, resiliency, not just zoning, but industrial resiliency, commercial, urban design, and how resiliency fits into the built environment. We have an urban design division, which releases its own plans and reports, and we coordinate with on all of our efforts. Our own neighborhood plans, you can see here, that's a picture of the Durham Avenue neighborhood study, where we continue implementation. Now that was over 2 years ago, but the planning work continues there. And a bit of a plug, we recently released, actually yesterday, our remote engagement website. We have to continue to rethink how we engage for our study around the 4 proposed Metro North stations in the East Bronx. And of course, we're now just beginning to understand the long-term effects of the pandemic, where, of course, the Bronx was disproportionately affected. And it shed light on many underlying inequities that we're aware of, but all of that ties in now to all of our work. So it's just another way that we have to adapt and think. Next slide. And so what is the community board's role in planning and land use? There's a few really specific ways that community board members play an important role and a direct role in decision making and planning. Whether it's engaging in neighborhood studies, whether large or small, or conversations like this, or the Boston Road conversation Carol had mentioned earlier. And then there's the formal review during the Uniform Land Use Review process. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Or influencing the city's long-term budgeting process. Our planning coordination division works with all the community boards across the city on the district needs statement, which is really in itself a long-term planning document. And Carol mentioned earlier, Manny is here, who is our liaison for Community Board 12. Every board across the city has a liaison from Department of City Planning. Next slide. So what is the zoning? I think what everyone wants to talk about on a Saturday morning, but it is, to put it high level, it essentially establishes a framework for appropriate development across the city. It's very blunt, but it lays out rules for what types of uses can take place, what types of buildings can be built on specific properties across the city. We update zoning, and zoning was really created in the interest of protecting public health, safety, and welfare. And that's really why and where zoning originally stemmed from. We'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. And so zoning, not going to get into too much of a history, but it's important to know where it came from. Had its early beginnings in the regulation of the built environment during the city's rapid population growth at the end of the 19th century. That growth was really paired with buildings that had inadequate light, air, and open space. And there was no control at that time of what was permitted and where. So you could have any use next to each other, no regulations on height, no regulations at all, really. I mean, imagine that now. And early regulations came in the form of the tenement laws, which began to address some of these conditions. Next slide. And so while residential buildings were regulated by the tenement laws, commercial buildings still remained unregulated at that time. And then, as construction methods changed, as the elevator came into play, buildings continued to grow taller and taller. And so by 1916, there were calls for additional bulk regulation. So this was really the first comprehensive zoning resolution, the 1916 resolution. It enacted very basic regulations that started to look at height, what types of uses could go next to each other. So you didn't have noxious manufacturing uses next to residential uses, or schools and uses like that. So it began to really think about that across the entire city. Next slide. And some of these terms, start to get a little in the weeds, but I just want to kind of talk through the evolution of how we got to where we are today. So by the mid 20th century, the 1916 resolution, started to become obsolete. In 1961, it was rewritten, and that serves a little bit of the base for our current zoning resolution. I'll talk about how it has evolved since then. It had its roots in shifting development trends, understanding the importance of open space. When the 1916 resolution was put in place, auto use wasn't prevalent, so that was incorporated into the thinking with this zoning resolution. A lot of the focus was on what we call tower and the park developments. You might think of it like some of the Mitchell-Lama buildings in Soundview, or the NYCHA buildings like an Edenwald campus, where you have large, taller buildings with open space, tracts of open space in between them. So next slide. And so I mentioned that the 1961 resolution, while kind of served as a base for what we're using today, it's been changed many times since then, and it really speaks to kind of the zoning resolution is a living document that constantly has to adapt and change with development trends and planning challenges. I've highlighted a couple of them here. Contextual zoning came in place in the late 1980s, and that really thought about buildings where you have things like street walls and height regulations and what we call quality housing. And a lot of the development you see now fits under those contextual zoning regulations. We put some of those in place when we did some of the rezonings in Board 12 that Justin will speak to. Mixed use districts, as manufacturing trends changed, and compatibility between certain residential uses and manufacturing uses became more of an option, we created this mixed use district. Port Morris was actually the first mixed district, what we call an MX district in the city. The public realm, of course, a lot of zoning changes have been made over the years in the interest of improving pedestrian quality and public realm quality. I think of our rules for the city's waterfront, for plaza spaces, as being really important changes that have improved the quality of our public realm across the city. Next slide. And just of course, going back to that, I also wanted to mention mandatory inclusionary housing, affordable housing. Was a major change in the zoning resolution. That was in 2016. I know that was one of the questions that you all had. And really now New York City has the strictest mandatory inclusionary housing rules. What that means is a requirement for permanent housing when there's a new zoning change that increases the density in a neighborhood. So new zoning changes now will require that a portion of that development to be permanently affordable. And that has been in place since 2016. Next slide. Zoning often takes center stage in development conversations, but really New York City's what we call an as of right framework. What do we mean by that? So development that happens that's permitted under the existing zoning district today. That means that if the Department of Buildings reviews the application or reviews the building permit and it complies with the underlying zoning, then no review at Department of City Planning is needed. And actually 90% of development in the city happens under what we call as of right development. I think that was important to just note how most development happens in the city. Next slide. So quickly, and I'm watching my own clock here. Want to clarify a couple of things that zoning does and does not do. It does establish long-term patterns of development. Things like regulating bulk and side yards and rear yards and height and setback. And it also determines what types of uses are allowed to go on a property and where. We talked a little bit about that earlier. Here we're showing a mixed-use building that has commercial uses on the ground floor and residential uses above. You can see it, where the height and setback is, and those are what's regulated by zoning. Zoning does not generate development if local market conditions aren't favorable. Just because a rezoning happens, it's not going to create development where there's not a market for it. And it also does not require the tear down of existing buildings. So if zoning rules change an existing building, that existing use is what we call grandfathered in. It is permitted to remain and continue to operate as a non-conforming use. It no longer conforms with that zoning, but it was existing, it's grandfathered, it can continue to operate. Thought those were really important. Next slide. And as we mentioned, zoning also regulates use. High level, it's broken down into three district categories: residential, commercial, and manufacturing. And sometimes you'll see the number next to a zoning district. As that number goes up, typically the intensity of the use goes up. So for example, an R4 zoning district permits higher density residential uses, so more residential units, a larger residential building than R1, R2, R3, etc. Generally, everything is broken up into 18 use groups across the city, what we call them, and those use groups are permitted in certain zoning districts. And what that allows is, for example, you wouldn't want a use group, a school, which is like a use group 3, permitted next to a use group 18, which permits things like garbage incinerators. So the use groups are broken up into these different categories in order to have that appropriate separation of uses. The board, and I just want to address one of the questions that came up, had some questions about shelters and where shelters are permitted and how. We talked about use groups, they fall under what is use group 5. So shelters are permitted in most commercial, some commercial and manufacturing districts. So if that district is mapped, they are permitted as of right. In New York City, we have a unique mandate to shelter our homeless population, and putting additional restrictions would not help to be able to ensure we're able to meet that mandate. You may have seen in rare cases where we do have special permits, you saw that for self-storage that came through recently, and for hotels in manufacturing and industrial business zones. Those are rare cases, but not the types of regulations that would apply to homeless shelters. Next slide. And I just wanted to quickly touch on this term because you'll see it attached to zoning districts. Could answer questions about detail and speak a lot more to, but when we talk about zoning, you'll hear the term floor area ratio. And to put it simply, it's really how much building can be built in relation to the size of your lot. You can see how it plays out real life in some of these examples here. You can have a really large lot with buildings spaced out. The example of maybe like a NYCHA campus where you have these large buildings of small portions built out, or you can have a side street on the right-hand side where you have a small lot where the building is built out, and they can have that same floor area ratio just because of the different lot sizes. Each zoning district has a permitted floor area ratio attached to it, and I think that's why it was important to just touch upon that. Next slide, and I have about 3 more quick slides before I'm going to pass it over to Justin, but we wanted to touch upon, so how does zoning change and why does zoning change? It's really for a few different reasons to support planning goals or a vision for the future. So something that comes out of planning process or something that was a long-term goal for the community or the community board, to balance future development and preserve character. If there's really a consistent or unique set of buildings or uses that don't match the current zoning that's there today, we're bringing existing buildings into compliance. You have a use that doesn't match the zoning that's there today, and it really restricts what they can do with their building, but it seems to be appropriate on that site. So changing the use to bring it into compliance, or to permit a change in density or change in uses on that site. The uses no longer match the long-term needs of that community. You might seek to change what's allowed on that site. And a lot of factors go into the thinking of that, the context and character of the area where the rezoning is, what are current and future land use trends, proximity to transit, or other amenities. A rezoning on its own does not hold an applicant to a specific site plan, but rather allows for a certain bulk or a certain use to go in place. It also, and HPD will touch upon this, does not require an applicant to create affordable housing or to seek subsidy from HPD to create that affordable housing. We can encourage it, we can have conversations, and we do, but it does not require that. Just quickly, you may have seen some of our processes, where the outcome is a zoning change. We talked a little bit about Jerome Avenue earlier. We talked about some of the areas around Bronx, Metro North stations in the East Bronx. And while these, and this kind of goes to the thought of, how do we choose where we're doing a neighborhood study, where we're talking to the community. While the goals of these types of plan may meet certain administrative priorities, such as creating new or preserving affordable housing, they also meet long-term community goals. For example, in the case of Jerome, we were looking at a corridor along transit where the uses that were there today did not meet the needs of that community. And it was a long-standing ask from those community boards along Jerome Avenue. Or with Metro North, where communities really want to capitalize on this transformative investment of new train service coming in. Each borough has its own studies that they're undertaking. And so, the similar thing, I know there were some questions. Manhattan's looking at a study and working with the community around Soho, NoHo. Brooklyn has been engaged in the Gowanus neighborhood for some time. Each of the boroughs is looking into that. Next slide.
Oh, God.
And just really quickly, what is that actual process to change zoning? Discretionary actions such as a change to the zoning map. Example, if you want to build a residential building in a district where it's not permitted today, that application for a zoning change has to go through the uniform land use review process. So whether it's a private application or a city-led process, while there are a number of conversations that happen before it enters public review, such as conversations with the community board, the appropriateness of the actions, does it align with community goals? All of this is factored in, but once it enters public review, once the City Planning Commission certifies that this application to change the zoning is complete, it has to enter the clock here that's shown on this slide. And this starts with the application going to the community board. The community board sees this complete application first. Community board holds a vote and makes a recommendation. They have to do that in a 60-day period. And then that recommendation, as you can see here, travels to the borough president's office, who holds his own vote, holds his own hearing, makes his own recommendation. Then that comes back to the City Planning Commission that holds a hearing, has a vote, makes a recommendation as well. And then it goes to City Council, who does the same thing, has a hearing, holds a vote. I think the important thing is, one, this application is going through each of these hearings where a recommendation is included for specific to that application, but the community board recommendation travels through that entire process and really informs the other votes. And I think that's a really important piece to note. So when you see that ULIP application at the community board, when a land use application comes in front of you, you're getting it first. And that vote, that recommendation is going to travel through this whole process. Next slide, and then I'm going to pass it over to Justin, who's going to talk a little bit about Community Board 12 stuff, which should be a little more interesting and relatable, but just wanted to again note before doing that zoning, again, while it often takes center stage, is one of many planning tools and planning strategies. You'll see again a little bit how we're working with HPD, but we always think about jobs and businesses, access and open space, and all of that factors into all of the conversations. They're all interrelated. So that's that. I'm going to pass it over to Justin. He's going to talk through some recent development and rezoning history in Community Board 12. Justin?
Yes, good morning, everyone. So we put together and did a bit of a look back for all of you about recent development and some history of rezonings in Community District 12. This is not an exhaustive look or really deep dive into the data, but it hopefully will give you a bit of a high level sense, a broad sense of what has happened in your district and what's happening today. So again, really just the start of the conversation, the start of really looking at what has been happening in Community District 12. So next slide, please. So first wanted to look at what have been the major area-wide rezonings that have happened in Community District 12. So we took a look back all the way back to 1995. And you can see on this map, the different colors are those large areas that have been rezoned since then. So in 1995, there was Wakefield, 2005, Olinville and Pelham Gardens, 2006, Woodlawn, 2007, Wakefield, Eastchester, and 2011, Williamsbridge, Baychester. And really, these rezonings had a lot of things in common. On the left, you'll see some common objectives. I pulled these from the Williamsbridge, Baychester rezoning from 2011, but it kind of speaks to all of them, where there were multiple goals trying to be accomplished by these rezonings. And so one piece of that were downzonings and contextual rezonings. And the goal of doing a downzoning or contextual rezonings here was to preserve unique neighborhood contexts and to make sure that new development conforms to the existing context, to really preserve the character of residential side streets in particular. Along with that, there are some smaller areas that were upzoned as well. And the goal of upzoning here was to encourage growth along wide streets and around transit hubs, commercial areas, places like White Plains Road, and to really shift the pressure from the residential areas to places that made more sense, to those wide streets, to those transit hubs, commercial areas. And then even looking at some of the areas that allowed for commercial, they're called commercial overlays, and possibly removing them when it made sense to make sure that we were strengthening residential side streets and precluding commercial encroachment from commercial areas into the interior residential areas. These are kind of the goals and the major rezoning actions that took place with these rezonings. Obviously there were probably lots of other private rezonings that were much smaller, but when we're talking about these area-wide rezonings, these are ones that the city sponsored, worked in tandem with you all in the community board and in the community to achieve long-term planning goals. Next slide, please. So just to talk about the most recent area-wide rezoning, the Williamsbridge rezoning, in the bottom left here, I have some of the major goals here, more specifically, where it really tried to aim to say that neighborhood lower density and contextual rezonings will preserve the existing scale and shift new development to main streets. And by shifting new development to main streets, it would shape White Plains Road, East Gun Hill Road, and East 233rd Street into vibrant, inviting, and walkable residential and commercial corridors. So that was really the main goals of the Williamsbridge rezoning. In the top left, you'll see the old zoning map. So this is pre the rezoning. You can see large swaths of R6, some R5 to the north and R4 to the east. And on the right, you see the current zoning map, where a lot of that R6 was downzoned or contextualized to an R6A, an R5, R4 districts. And then, around White Plains Road and Gun Hill Road, an upzoning to an R7A. And again, That was to, shape that area into a vibrant, inviting, walkable residential commercial area. Also on this map, I'll point out, we've highlighted in purple any new buildings since 2012. And so you can see there's been some development all over the neighborhood, but particularly a concentration on White Plains Road. And that was really, where that new development was intended to go. The large new development was intended to go, but still some infill development, which again was not, precluded by the rezoning, but was just the intent was that it would be more contextual, it fit more into the neighborhood. So next slide, I think that we have some examples here that can really show that. So on the top right here, we have 725 East 219th Street. This was built in 2018. Again, it's on a side street. It has 3 units. This is an area that was an R6, but was downzoned to an R5. And by doing that, really the amount of floor area that it could build was almost cut in half. And as you can see from the picture, what was built was a building that really seems to fit into the context of the 2 buildings next to it, and seems much more appropriate than a building that would have been twice its size had it not been downzoned. And then on the bottom, we have an example of a larger building that was built on White Plains Road, 3639 White Plains Road. This was built in 2014, has 69 residential units. And again, this was an area that went from an R6 up to an R7A and facilitated this type of development that was much more appropriate on a wider street near transit. You have the 25 line right there. And yeah, is a good example of the type of development that was encouraged by the rezoning itself. Next slide, please. So we also took a look at demographics. And so this chart here just shows some samplings of things that we pulled out to look at. It's comparing the American Community Survey from 2006 to 2010 to the American Community Survey of 2014 to 2018. And while you see some changes in numbers, some possible growth in population, which is probably accurate given the growing nature of the city and the Bronx, especially during this time period, based on the geography and the size that we're looking at, we can't say that there's any significant change in population. But what I can say is, with the 2020 census data coming out, hopefully very soon, I think that gives us a good opportunity to take that look back from 2020 to 2010 and 2020 back to 2000 to really see how your community district is changing and growing. Next slide, please. So this chart here, we wanted to take a look at development over time. So this is really looking at every building in your district today. And going back to 1900. And in the blue are the buildings, and the orange are the residential units. So in the buildings could also be commercial buildings, industrial buildings as well. But we wanted to kind of see by decade, where have been the areas where there's been a lot of development or not a lot of development. You can see in the 20s and 30s, there was a lot being built, a bit of a dip during the war years in the 40s, and then, picking back up in the 50s and 60s. A dramatic decrease in the 70s, as we all know, the financial crisis, the effects of depopulation and white flight and all of those things. And really, not seeing a whole ton of development in the 80s or 90s as well. Started to tick up a bit in the 2000s, and then, started to level off a little bit in the last decade. Next slide, please. And then this chart shows new buildings going back to 1994. So zooming in on the most recent history of building development. And also putting on top of this chart when those area-wide rezonings occurred that I talked about in the beginning. So again, you can kind of see this curve go up and then back down, and really seeing a lot of development in the mid-2000s. And then a huge drop off in 2009. That's pretty consistent with what happened across the city and across the country with the economic crash then. But then never really seeing building development start to increase again since then. I don't think we can say 100% that the effects of all these rezonings caused development to really drop and not increase. but certainly played a factor in what we see here on the screen. Also wanted to point out mandatory inclusionary housing and zoning for quality and affordability that passed in 2016. Also haven't seen a huge significant increase in building since then in this district. And I also believe that there's only been one MIH rezoning in Community District 12, which is the 241st Street rezoning. So this is just a snapshot, and I think the beginning of a conversation. But I think it's helpful to kind of look back at what's happened over time and in most recent history to start maybe driving down deeper and asking more questions. So happy to answer questions and talk more about this in the Q&A portion. But at this point, I'm going to pass it off to HPD.
You muted, Mr. Weinstein. You're muted. You got to unmute yourself.
Okay. Who would have thought 10 years ago that the most common phrase in the English language would be "you're on mute"? So, we're going to do a brief, to begin with, a brief overview of HPD. HPD does a lot of things, but I think the focus of interest this morning was development, was new construction, and we'll go a little more deeply into that. Next slide, please. And that shows. One of the things about HPD in terms of what we do, and we do a lot of things, but the name itself, Housing Preservation and Development, very succinctly sums up what we do. There's a lot of different things that we do that are concerned and focused on the preservation of housing, particularly affordable housing. And then there's the development of new housing, particularly affordable housing. Okay, next slide, please. So we'll start off with the HPD overview. Here it's described as we promote the quality and affordability of the city's housing stock, preserving the enforcement of the Housing Maintenance Code, which we'll mention in a minute, creating new affordable housing and engaging communities. Next slide, please. In terms of preserving existing affordable housing, we have financing programs. One of the things that happens is the reason that the city has financing programs is to make sure that there is affordable housing. In a perfect world, I suppose, if somebody wanted to build a building, or if somebody wanted to upgrade their existing building, they would go to a bank. Actually, in a wonderfully perfect world, they'd have the money to do it. But since few people do, so they would generally go to a bank, and through some kind of a mortgage loan, they would get money to do what needs to be done. Unfortunately, the costs of doing these things, particularly from the banks, is high, and therefore that is not a good source of funding and financing if you want to do affordable housing. Remember, if you're a bank and somebody wants to do something, they want to know that the bank wants to know that there's enough income coming into that person or entity to pay back what the bank has loaned out. Well, we'll do the same thing, only what we'll do is we'll offer what we sometimes refer to as cheap money, meaning that money that can be more easily paid back, if at all. And so that's how, and that's why the city has these programs, in order to make sure that there is a resource to go to for financing. Then there's the broad area of protecting tenants. And there are some specific things that have been done recently, extension of the right to counsel for people who are being sued, let's say, by their landlords, tenant anti-harassment units, and various things that we'll try to do, because most of the people who live in New York City live in existing housing. They're not living or moving into new housing. And so we have to make sure that we preserve what exists. Next slide, please. Okay, one of the things that is probably best known to many, many people is code enforcement, the enforcement of the New York City Housing Maintenance Code. The state has a law, the city has its own law, and basically what these laws do is they describe what someone who owns residential housing is responsible for doing in terms of providing the needed services and making the needed repairs. Next slide, please. And so this is the system where if somebody has a problem, they have no heat or hot water, they have leaks that the landlord is not repairing, things like that. If they're not getting any good response from the landlord or from the manager, then they would call 311, which everybody knows is the citywide help desk, so to speak. And if it's something that requires, and then what happens is the 311 system through HPD, through code enforcement, we will contact that landlord to tell them that there's a problem, you need to do something. If it's something that warrants an actual inspection, code enforcement will send an inspector there. If it is in fact a violation of the housing code, that violation gets issued, and then the landlord or manager has a certain amount of time to repair it. If they don't, they can be taken to housing court and fined. Next slide, please. Okay, but I think more the concern and interest again for this morning is creating new affordable housing. HPD basically does three things. We provide land when available. We provide financing, and as I said, it's financing that makes it feasible to do affordable housing, and various kinds of tax incentives. We'll get into a little deeper later, but let me just say, tax incentives are probably the greatest tool in the entire country for doing housing, for providing affordable housing. And then just gives a few facts here, what the city has done citywide since 2014. This looks like a very small number, 638 in District 12, but that's not surprising when you think that a lot of what the city has done are in areas that unfortunately suffered tremendously during the 1970s and 80s, areas like Central Brooklyn, Upper Manhattan, and the South Bronx. Ward 12, while having some problems, unfortunately did not have anywhere near the amount of blight or devastation that took place in some of those areas. And therefore also one of the things that happened during those time periods, in those geographic areas, were that people, owners of property, could not pay their real estate taxes. And at that time, with the way the law was, the city could take those properties through a process called in rem, and therefore that gave the city the resource to then first develop new housing because the city owned the housing. Again, well, there was some of that in Ward 12, very little compared to most other areas. Developing that city land is, of course, a priority because we don't want the taxpayers' money to be used to manage housing and repair housing in itself. And so that's why we're given a choice between doing something with city-owned site or a private site. We want to do it on the city site. Again, Board 12 had very little property that became city-owned, and at this point, even less. I'll just throw out one example. There's a little lot at 1234 East 23rd Street. It's only like a 25 by 100, and it will be developed. A few years ago, the city issued a request for proposals for infill sites, because that's mostly what we have left in the Bronx. We don't have much city-owned land of big amounts of land. They're mostly small infills, and this was the only one in District 12. And so we included this in a cluster that is mostly sites in the South Bronx, but there was nothing else nearby, and so we couldn't do a North Bronx cluster. So this piece is actually attached to a number of other sites in terms of the project. Development team was selected, and their plan for this particular site is just a two-family home. So that is one example of some city-owned land that is left and that will be developed. One of the things that we focus on are trying to have the involvement of nonprofit developers, of MWBEs. And then the inclusionary, which city planning is also referred to, that's a tool as well. Next slide, please. We have several different programs that involve new construction, depending on what types of income eligibilities, the size of the building that might get built. Without going into all the details about all of them, this is a list of those. Probably the most common one is what we call ELA, extremely low and low affordability program. That would be a multiple dwelling apartment building where most of the units are for people of low income. A couple of side notes. When we do provide financing for buildings to be built, and we'll go into more detail about that in a bit. One of the things that's been the policy of this administration is to do a range of eligibility. And so we'll explain that a little later, how we do that. But the focus of, depending on which program, so like for ELA, the focus is more on the very low and low income levels. A mix and match is more low to moderate. The mixed middle income, which we refer to as M squared, is more of a higher income. We actually don't do many of those because that's not our priority. NCP, new construction program, is somewhat smaller buildings, say 20 to 40 units. And so we have slightly different requirements for that. SARA, the senior program, for many, many years, the largest tool for building senior housing in the country was the HUD 202 program. It was a federal program. Congress, in their wisdom or lack thereof, basically cut out the funding for that some years ago. And so there was a few years where very little new senior housing was being built. And so the city created its own program, SARA. And developers come to us, and we have a staff that just works on that in order to create senior housing. The supportive housing loan program is a program which provides financing to build housing mostly for formerly homeless. And we'll go into that in a little more detail as well. Open Door, in the time between 1900 and 1910, I'm sorry, 2000 and 2010, we were able to start doing more home ownership, multifamily home ownership. Prior to that, there was many small homes home ownership done. But during that period, we started doing more multifamily home ownership, co-ops and condos. Not everybody wants to rent. Not everybody wants to own a home. They don't have to worry about their plumbing themselves in their backyard and things like that. And so when we were able to, a few years ago, we were able to start a new multifamily homeownership program called Open Door. The very first building that was done through that program, there's a photo here, is Sydney House in your district, 839 Tilden. And that was done by Habitat for Humanity, working with another developer. And so, like I said, we haven't done many through this program so far, but this one in your district was the first. I might also mention that this is touted as the largest building ever done by Habitat for Humanity in the world. And they just recently had their ribbon cutting ceremony for this. Then there's also, again, the tax incentive programs that we talk about. One of the things that is important to know is that when we are going to finance a new building, and whether it's a city-owned site that we pick somebody or a private site where they come to us, it's not just that they come in and say, okay, I need $10 million or whatever. We want to make sure that the building gets built properly, that it's going to serve our purposes, the city's purposes. And so every proposal that comes in and asks for financing is reviewed by our finance staff, who effectively act like bankers in this regard, by our architects, and by our environmental planners to make sure that what the environmental impact is. One of the things about the design guidelines and review by our architects that we would like to talk about is just last month. And there's a big fat book that is our design guidelines. So every developer who wants to build using our programs has to have an architect who becomes familiar with those guidelines. But the more interesting thing is, and unfortunately, we had to learn through the past year about how to do things even better. And so we've issued new guidelines that include some requirements that we learned about through the pandemic. A couple of things just as examples, that for now on, every time a new building is going to be financed through our program, they have to have broadband available in every single apartment to make sure that people have computer access. They have to make sure that the apartments have cooling options and natural air. Just something that may sound small, but there's never been a requirement to have screens on the windows. And a lot of people, if they don't have screens, even in warm weather, they're not going to open their windows because they don't want to let in flies and bugs. And so from now on, every building financed through our program has to have screens on their windows. And there's a whole list of pages and pages of things that are going to be done. So like I said, we always try to improve. Next slide, please. We talk about tax credits and incentives. Again, it's the major tool. These are all numbers that refer to certain laws, sections of laws that create the programs. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about them. The ones that you probably see most common are 421A, which is used a lot by developers who are building housing without financing from us, without the subsidy. They would then use the 421A tax exemption program. What that does is it then requires a certain percentage of the units be affordable, be below, have rents that are affordable to people below a certain income. Almost all of these are, I guess, what you would call as of right, which basically means if the developer follows the rules, fills out the forms correctly, does what they have to do, then they will get the tax incentive. One exception is the Article 11, where it needs city council approval, but the rest of them do not. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, city planning talked a little about inclusionary housing, mandatory inclusionary. Basically, I describe mandatory inclusionary housing in this way, that if a developer wants to build something and wants to do a rezoning to be able to increase their density, to build more than the current zoning would allow, and they're going to go to the city planning, and go through the ULURP that was described, through all the steps of the ULURP. If that developer wants the city to agree to that improvement, that increase, the least they could do is provide some affordable housing. And so whereas the developer might have been planning to do a building with, let's say, 100 apartments, and it's in a marketable area where he can get pretty high rents, well, that's fine. But if he's going to then be able to, through a rezoning, to, let's say, 150 units, well, then the least he could do is provide some number of those units that are more affordable than what the market might even allow in that area. That's the gist of mandatory inclusionary housing. And it shows here that depending on, which option they use, basically they're always either option 1 or 2, either 25% or 30%. Just one little nuance about this, and we always talk about the percentage of the units that are affordable. Technically, it's the floor area that is used. So if we say 25%, as the chart shows, it means 25% of the residential floor area must be affordable, or 30%, depending on which option it is. So that's really the gist of mandatory inclusionary housing. Next slide, please. It's just a map that shows, where some of this has been done. At the moment, it's showing none in District 12. We really haven't had a situation, I guess, where developer has done a rezoning to take advantage of the greater density, which would then require or want to do the MIH, and then therefore, require the units. I suspect that there will be some done as time goes on. Next slide, please. Okay, one of our priorities is how to best provide housing for what we call the vulnerable New Yorkers. We have a division called the Division of Special Needs Housing. It includes that SARA program for seniors. It includes our supportive housing loan program. And basically the idea is that we want to provide as much housing as possible for people who are homeless, who in the shelters. Everybody, a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago, I guess, when all of a sudden it became known that every night that there were about 60,000 people in the shelters, everybody was aghast, everybody was upset, and rightfully so. But one of the ways that you deal with that, aside from social and economic issues, is to provide housing. There are many people that are in shelters because there was a fire. Unfortunately, over the past year, many people have gone into shelters because they, lost their jobs and couldn't afford the rent anymore. And so, we want to be able to do something about providing permanent housing. And I emphasize that again, it's permanent housing. HPD does not provide financing to build shelters or transitional housing. We provide financing to do permanent housing. The typical supportive housing building that we do will have 60% of the units for formerly homeless. Those are referrals that come from the Department of Homeless Services. I say formerly homeless, by the way, again and again, because as soon as they get approved for an apartment and they sign the lease, they're no longer homeless. And so you might have, let's say, a building of 100 apartments, 60 of them might be for formerly homeless. The other 40 are then for general population. And they, like any other building that gets built through our programs. So that's what our supportive housing loan program does. We always know that there's some concerns about housing like this, but we generally have found it to be an extremely successful program. Again, I'll emphasize that the person comes in, they become a rent stabilized tenant. If they want to live there for 20, 30 years, they can. And there's no mark on their door that indicates how they got there. And the other thing that's important is every one of these buildings has on-site supportive services because there are people who do need help in terms of dealing with issues, job training, things like that. And so in order to approve a project on this program, there has to be a service provider, not just a regular developer. Okay. Next slide, please. One of the examples I'll mention just before I go on, in your district, 4339 White Plains Road, I think there was a picture that was on the previous slide, is a building that was built through this program. Okay, now, the formerly homeless set-asides. Even though we finance buildings that are going to provide housing for people coming out of the shelters, there's not enough. We need to provide more. And so originally it was a policy, then it became the law that when someone does get financing through our program to build a building through Ella or Mix and Match, one of those programs, they have to set aside, depending on what it is, 15% or 30% of the units for formerly homeless. And so let's say it's a building is 100 units. Let's say it's through our Ella program, or basically a low income program. 15 of those 100 units have to be set aside for people formerly homeless. The chart there shows, again, Ella, it's either 15 or 30. Mix and Match is 15. The SARA program, the senior program, because we want to make sure that homeless seniors are provided for, that has a 30% requirement. And then it shows this on the supportive housing, the typical supportive housing program again, 60% of the units are for the formerly homeless. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, community engagement and outreach, and specifically here we're talking about community board. And we split it up depending if it's city-owned property or privately owned property. If property is city-owned, we generally look to dispose of it through a competitive process, like a request for proposals, or also what's called a request for qualifications. Request for proposals is where we make an announcement, we offer a property, and then development teams submit proposals. We review those proposals, and again, they're reviewed by our planning staff, our finance staff, our architects, all review those proposals, and then we select what we think is the best proposal. Request for qualifications is similar, except it's not always site specific. It may be where we have a bunch of sites like infill sites, and then we ask for proposals as to how development teams would deal with that, and then we just match them up. But the more common process is the RFP, the request for proposals. If we're going to include a property in a RFP, we will notify the community board that it's in. We want to make sure that there isn't some other plan for the site that we're not aware of, or if there's even some suggestions as to maybe what kind of housing might be built there. And so we'll do that. We then issue the RFP. There's time for the development teams to submit their proposals. When that development team is selected, we will then have them go back to the community board and show what has been selected. During the selection period itself, there is no community board involvement. That just legally cannot be. It's like part of the city procurement process. But once the development team and project are selected, we want the community board to know what was done, what was selected. Then we go through our pre-ULER process, which was described earlier. And we're at the point where it's ready, it goes into ULERP. The first step in ULERP, as was said, is the community board. Of course, the community board doesn't have to, but in almost every case, the community board wants to have a public hearing and make a recommendation. Most community boards want that item to first go to their appropriate committee, like a housing land use committee, and that's fine. That way, it's a more thorough discussion of what it is, and then the community board votes its recommendation, it's for approval or not. If after ULERP is finished, because sometimes, unfortunately, because we have a long pipeline, a project may not actually close and start construction for quite a while after ULEP is finished. If something significantly changes in terms of the project, we will tell the development team to go back to the community board and inform them of that. So that's how we handle city-owned sites. Private sites, what we're talking about here is where someone owns a piece of property, wants to use city financing, HPD financing, and comes to us for that financing. We require that any project that is going to use our financing program go to the community board, alert the community board about, and that means that list I said, the LO, the mix and match, Sarah, obviously, supportive housing, obviously, they need to inform the community board, and we require that. And again, if there's any significant changes later on, we would tell them to go back. Okay, next slide, please. A subject that's often brought up that people want to know about is local hiring or labor outreach or requirements. This slide just describes a few of the things. There is no specific legal requirement for local hiring. We obviously strongly suggest to developers that they look into that. If there's some local organization that can help out in that way, we encourage that. Hire New NYC is one way of sort of indirectly getting to that. where if developer goes to hire NYC, hopefully people from the local area have registered that they're seeking jobs. And so hopefully that match can be made. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, how do people get into these buildings? In order to have fairness, in order to make sure that the proper people are getting into these buildings, so every project that gets financed through our programs has to be marketed through what we call Housing Connect. Housing Connect is a process that has evolved over the years. It's constantly looking to see how it can be improved. It is extremely successful. For many, many years, it was a manual process where if somebody wanted to apply to move into a new building that was coming up, say on White Plains Road, they had to get an application, fill it out, send it back. And then if there was also a building over on Baychester Avenue, if somebody wanted to get into that, they'd have to go through that process again. The system, some years back, the system was computerized through Housing Connect. It's so much easier now. What you do is you just go into the system, you set up your profile, you know, who you are, where you live, how many in your house are, what your income is, all those kinds of things. And then you have access to the list of developments that are currently receiving applications. Generally speaking, when a building is approximately 2/3 to 3/4 finished is when the developer has to then start doing the marketing. That marketing is supervised by HPD. If HDC, the Housing Development Corporation, which is our sister agency that provides financing, if they are involved, their staff oversees it, but otherwise it's our staff that oversees the entire marketing process. And so what happens is when somebody goes into the system, creates their profile, and then looks at the list of the developments that are currently taking applications, they can just go the ones that they want. Let's say that they live in the Bronx and they want to stay in the Bronx. They can just look for all the Bronx projects and go click, 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 and that's it. No individual applications. Much, much easier than trying to get the vaccination for the virus. And so it's so in fact, it's so successful that what ends up happening is, let's say there's a building that's going to be 100 apartments. It's not unusual for there to be 50,000 applications. First, because there is an affordable housing crisis, but also because it's so simple. And some people will just go the entire list. They'll just go click, 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 click. The marketing staff tells me that other than ineligibility, which can happen, the next biggest reason why people are rejected is that they just don't show up. You know, that they may have clicked to begin with, and then when they're contacted, they just don't respond because maybe they live in Bronx and they don't want to live in Brooklyn, and maybe that's where they get the call from. So, you know, this describes again basically how it works. There is a community preference at this point. Buildings that are built through our program, our financing programs, currently have, you know, through Ella and Mix and Match, a 50% community preference. And what that means is the way that works is the computer does it so that when it's time, when the deadline is passed, everybody's application in quotes are in, the computer then kicks forward everybody whose zip code is in that community district. And that's how they can start off, you know, figure that. Only when the 50% mark is hit does then the computer reopen it to everybody else. Long ago, for many years, I know in the Bronx, there was often difficulty getting the community preference. They was just overreaching it. Since it's been computerized, I'm told by the marketing people, virtually every building in the city that gets done through our programs has been able to reach the community preference. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this just talks about more about what we just talked about. So next slide, please. Okay, what is affordable housing? Okay. Everybody always asks and talks about what is affordable housing. Many years ago, somebody, I don't know who, probably some economist, decided that housing could be considered affordable if the household is not spending more than 30% of its gross income on rent and utilities. And so this just shows very quickly at certain income levels what that translates into. So for example, if the family's household income is 50,000, 30% of that on a monthly basis would be 1,500. They should not be paying more than that. It actually has become within the industry almost that is what they should be paying. And our programs are all geared toward that, toward people paying 30% of their income for rent. Next slide, please. Okay. When we establish income eligibility for the buildings built through our programs, there's a system called the area median income. I think it's very often misunderstood as to what that is and how it works. First of all, median is the middle. It's like an average, but it's really not an average. It's like when you're driving on the street and there's a piece of concrete down the middle of the road. It's called the median. Median is the middle. And so if you take the whole New York, what's called the New York metropolitan area, and the federal government does this every year, they establish for all the metropolitan areas all over the country, what is the median income at different household sizes for that area. And so this shows that a median income for the New York area for a family of 3 has these medians. So the median income, the midpoint, and what is referred to as then 100% of the AMI, because 100% of something is all of it, is something. So the 100% is approximately $102,000 for the New York area. But what happens is we don't use that number really in establishing eligibility. We use percentages of it. So for example, if let's say there's an apartment in a building that is being advertised as eligible for people at 60% of the AMI, then it would be for people who make up to 61,000. So for them, that 102,000 number is irrelevant. And if it's only a 30% AMI unit, then the income that would be required to do it would be only up to 30,000 roughly. Okay, next slide, please. And again, this shows how it's used. The overwhelming majority of projects that are built through our programs in the Bronx have a range. Again, that's a policy that this administration started when it came in, that mixed income, true mixed income is a good thing. And therefore, rather than say that every building on this street is going to be 100% of AMI and every building on that street is going to be 40% AMI, that's not reasonable and it's not good social policy. And so the typical building that gets built through our programs has a range of income eligibility, roughly, let's say, from about 30% AMI to about 80 or 100% AMI. And then within that range, there's different levels. So let's say it's a 100-unit building. There might be 10 units at 30%, 20 units at 50%, 20 units at 70%, something like that. Realizing again, remembering that 15% at least have to be set aside for formerly homeless. And that way, within the same building, you get a variety of income levels. There's nothing that says who's who. Everything is the same. If you have a dishwasher in a 100% AMI unit, you'll have a dishwasher in a 30% AMI unit. It's all the same. And so this shows, for example, for different income levels and different size apartments, how it works and what the rent might be. And I know very often there's concerns, there's criticism, and like I said, if we use the AMI itself, the 100% as the eligibility level, that would be a problem. But we don't. We use a percentage of it. And the great majority of units that are built through our programs in the Bronx and developed have units that are far less than for people at 100% of the AMI. Okay, next slide, please.
So, Mr. Weinstein, let me jump in here. So, so this is about the last couple. We want to leave some time for questions and answers.
Yeah, well, this is my last slide anyway.
Okay, all right.
This just gives you some phone numbers that you can try to use. And then I'm done.
Okay, so thank you, Mr. Or you want to go back to the last slide so you can give people the numbers? I just want to, and then I'll open it up for questions and answers.
Yeah, if you have a code, what you think is a code enforcement complaint, you should call 311 first. But then if there's a problem, and you're not going to respond, then you can try this number. That was one of the questions I know that was asked about, like, some direct contacts.
Okay, so board members and community, I hope that you learned something. I think, and again, because I know that I always learn something when I hear from city planning and from HPD. And so, what I would like to do is take this opportunity to answer questions. So I know our district manager has been monitoring the chat. So I think the way that I want this to go is to answer the questions in the chat first. And if you're on the call and you have a question, once the questions in the chat have been addressed, I think I counted 4, maybe 4 or 5, then what I would like for you to do is to raise your hand, and that's either you scroll over your name in the participant section, or I think if you go into the reactions part at the bottom of your page and you raise your hand, and then we can recognize you. So what I would like to do, George, if you could come back and tag, I think I saw 4 questions first in the chat, and then we can start it from there.
Yeah. So Carl Anzano had basically 3 questions throughout the conversation. The first question being, I guess to sum it up, is the city continuously grows. Is there a tipping point on how many people the city can support and or accommodate?
Sure. Do you want to take them one by one, George?
Oh, yeah. So the third, so his second and third question was when you were talking about, I guess somebody was talking about 20% in statistics, and he said, why are changes in statistics over 20% considered non-significant? And the final question was on the Euler process, when someone was talking about that, was that we needed more than just a vote. We needed a vote and not just a recommendation, because the community board's role is advisory.
I'll take the first one.
Okay.
Thank you, George. Thank you, everyone, for your patience and attention. And the first question about the population of the city and how are we assured that there are sufficient services like electric, like sewers and schools, I'm assuming is all of that's baked into it. I'll start with one thing, which is an observation and an important fact, which is that the Bronx is back to its population high. Those of you who've been here for a number of years, we know that the Bronx lost a lot of population. Some community boards lost, as much as a third of their population in the 80s and the 70s. But we're back. We're back to our population, all-time population high. We've grown in different places than what it was in 1970. So our population high, just to cite the number, is 1.4 million people. We're back. But we're growing in different places. Why are we growing in different places? Because some of the zoning has changed. The zoning is a long-term tool to promote growth and shape growth in the city. And when we make a change in an area, it is for the long term. And it is intended, like we saw in some of the examples that Justin presented, which is, to put growth towards transit or wide streets and protect growth, protect the buildings and neighborhoods on the side streets. That said, so we're growing, in the right ways. Whenever we do a zoning change, the city undertakes we have a city environmental quality review process, and that requires us to look at the services in the city to see if there will be sufficient, if that zoning change could have a potential negative impact on those services. Okay, so that's really important. And if there is, then we have to come up with some kind of, typically we have to come up with some kind of mitigation plan. So we will look at the sewers, we will look at the schools in the area, we will look at the parks, all of the basic infrastructure of a city whenever we're promoting growth. So that's a really important way, but it's not the only way. I would also point to just the constant coordination between the capital agencies and the growth patterns of the city. So the Department of Environmental Protection, for example, the School Construction Authority, both of those are constantly looking at, those are two key, police, fire, all of those, two key agencies. We feed them, and so I know HPD does too. Where are we growing? Where are new housing units coming online? So that in their long-term planning, they can account for that kind of growth, so that we can make sure the sewers are adequate, that the schools are adequate as the city grows in the long term. So while there's no answer to, like, what's the cap? We're constantly monitoring what is the capacity for the existing infrastructure, and how does that infrastructure have to grow as the city has to grow, as the city is growing.
Okay. Anything on the 20% and the and maybe you can speak briefly in the answer on his request for the vote. I know that Corey Johnson and the City Council just released a very comprehensive, as a matter of fact, it's called the comprehensive, I guess, land use review process or whatever it is, which is supposed to give community boards, I guess, more of a say. I'm not so keen on it. I shouldn't say keen. I'm not sure that it does. But do you see a process by which the community board will play more of a role in some of these developments on land use?
Well, I mean, I think that that's exactly why the ULURP process was set up, was to give a voice to the community boards. It does, the voice is an important voice because it travels, as Sean was describing, it travels through every other decision maker's, before they make an opinion, they understand what the community board thinks about it. And if there are conditions that are placed on it. It's hard to say what will happen with the current legislation. We're always constantly balancing the proper role for the community boards, because if you think about it, there are a lot of decisions that have to be made about some things that everyone would say no to. Yes. Everyone would say no. And we can't necessarily have that across the city. But getting your perspective on it and changes you might want to see in it, that's a really important opinion to voice, and to have all the decision makers, all the rest of the decision makers, to hear your opinion about from you. The rest of the question, I guess.
Yeah, the 20% statistics. I don't know. I mean, maybe Carl can, after we do the questions. So Alfredo, just so everybody knows, Alfredo had 2 questions. John Isaac had a question, and Lisa Hayes had a question. So Alfredo's 2 questions kind of also segues into what you were just speaking to. His question is, how do we get developers in Community Board 12 that are developing even as of right to come before the board? The only thing that I would add to that is his suggestion is that every development should come before the board. We have had issues even with developments that receive funding from HPD coming before the board, not coming before the board. So, how do we mandate that they come before the board, or should we?
Well, George, let me just say first, if you ever have a situation where you know that someone is getting financing through us and you've not heard anything from them, let me know.
Does that include the 421A tax credit program?
21A, I believe they only have to notify the board.
Okay, they don't have to come before us.
I don't believe so.
Okay, that's the one that we were talking about. There's a Mark Stagg has a number of developments within our district that, I mean, the only reason he came to us is because we forced Adolfo Carrion's hand on an issue and he made him come.
Without promising anything, I would say anytime that you actually ask a developer to come and they just refuse, let me know. And then
Okay.
possibly then the next time that they do come to us for financing, I'll remember that.
Well, no, I mean, I don't want to belabor the point, but there have been some developments, the one on Bullard Avenue that may or may not happen right above the NYPD. That's the problem. And I guess that's Alfredo's concern, is that there are people who are eyeballing our district in terms of looking at future developments, and they don't let us know unless they've already spoken to you and you tell them to come and meet with us. It should be a matter of course that we are part of the notification process, not because HPD tells them, but because this is what they should do on their own as good citizens or as good neighbors. Those people on Bullard, to this day, I mean, even the councilman would come to me and be like, "Oh, did you meet with these folks?" And I'm like, "No, I don't even know who they are." So,
Okay.
His second point was, you spoke to it in the presentation, Boston Road rezoning, is that still moving forward?
Yeah, I'll speak a little to that, and then I'll ask maybe if Sean wants to jump in too. So yes, we met with you all a while ago, if you remember, because we really wanted to get your perspective on Boston Road, given its current condition. It's zoned a lot for heavy commercial auto uses. You can tell that just by driving down the corridor. It doesn't really serve local needs. Has had that kind of pattern for a century. And so we're constantly looking at corridors to understand how they might change and serve current needs versus past needs. And we had interest in several lots on Boston Road from private developer seeking the very far north of it. And we came and we wanted to understand, well, what does everyone here think about it? What are your issues with the corridor? How might it improve to better meet your needs? So that would inform us as well as we're having conversations with this developer. And I think they're still kind of in a holding pattern. It's very hard to say. They've not made significant progress in the application. I'll let Sean speak to that, or Manny. As we know it, but there could be a number of reasons why that would be the case. What I would say to you is we would like to continue conversations about Boston Road regardless. Just if there's interest in the board in doing that, just because we see it as a kind of an opportunity within your district to meet some of your local needs. Certainly meet housing needs, to have a corridor that is just better meeting local needs. Sean, I don't know if you could say a word about the applicants or anything else you want to add.
Sure, and thanks. I was just going to add, and this is actually the perfect example. While the formal land use review, the formal EULA process, is just that, the formal public review process for changing the zoning. It goes back to the importance of planning. There are many conversations that are happening before any formal zoning change goes into place. And it just stresses the importance of a conversation now with the community around the Boston Road, where we've seen interest from some developers along the corridor. It goes back to the importance of those previous rezonings that Justin spoke to, the community district needs statement. Again, stressing the importance of that the community is making sure that their land use needs are part of that document. The stronger that document is, the stronger a voice the community has. And all of these things, are taking place constantly. So again, while the formal process is one thing that comes to the board and has that recommendation, there are a number of other conversations that are really setting up how development happens in the community. As with Boston Road, I don't think we've We haven't really heard anything new from a specific set of developers, but again, we know that there's interest in the corridor, and from conversations with you all, we know that what's permitted there today along the corridor, is quite outdated, and isn't really serving the needs of Community Board 12. So we want to continue to have that conversation, not just about the zoning that's in place there and changing that, but thinking about the needs of transportation. It's always been an auto oriented corridor, and so yeah, we're happy to have those. But that's an example of those other conversations where the community board has a voice early on, before anything gets to the formal change of the actual zoning.
Okay. John Isaacs has the next question. It's we changed our zoning. It sounds like it was a down zoning to protect the character of the neighborhood, and we were told that the rezoning has now hurt us. Can someone explain the purpose of that rezoning, the down zoning? I think it's a down zoning, was to stop developers from removing a single family home and building several multifamily homes. This impacts parking, sewer character, and et cetera. I know somebody spoke to it earlier, but can you?
Yeah, I mean, I would ask for a little more clarification from John Isaacs about, you were saying that it's hurt us, and what do you mean by that? Are you saying that you're seeing development that's contrary to the zoning? What can you say a little bit more about that?
I mean, I was just told in previous discussions that the down zoning hurt us. So I was just questioning how it hurt us, if you know about it.
The downzoning hurt us. Well,
Or,
I mean,
or do you think that we benefited by it?
I mean, look, obviously, for the long-term benefit of a community, we think that getting the zoning right is important and will always benefit the community in the long run. And what that zoning did, so say, for example, in the Williamsbridge, where we kind of downzoned some of the side streets and then upzoned, White Plains Road, for example. You by protecting the character of the neighborhood on the side streets, you will not see kind of erratic development patterns, and you'll have much more of a consistent character. That goes to property values, that goes to quality of life, and all of those things that help, kind of make a community feel more stable. So I don't see that as hurting you, and it allows the community. But really important is that that kind of a proposal allows the community to grow in the right places. You still want to be growing. You still want to be dynamic. The whole city is growing, and we want to make sure that we're, as we're in an affordable housing crisis. We need to be able to grow housing in the right places. So a proposal like that kind of did that by allowing some of the zoning to be upzoned near the transit and downzoning and protecting the side streets. So I don't know if that answers your question, because it's I don't know whether it's something hurts you is I guess a perspective. It's certainly not my perspective.
All right. Lisa Hayes had the next question regarding Housing Connect. It's been impossible since 2017. When trying to contact the staff, they were limited and gave me no assistance. In addition, I find it to be that affordable housing. I don't find it to be, I guess the AMI or whatever what we're calling affordable is not affordable for the average person. This is also the experience of many CB12 members. I'm happy everything has been going well for people. Please let marketing know that we're still not getting preference here in CB12. Maybe you can speak, I know you spoke to the lottery system, but one of the things that we just realized with this new housing the senior housing that's happening on 233rd Street, the Riseboro project, they're using a housing ambassador. That was new even for me. Can you speak to the housing ambassador program as well as the lottery system?
Well, in terms of housing ambassador, we had let it be known that we wanted to set up a program where local groups could assist people with the process. I believe there are approximately 10 organizations in the Bronx that have applied and been accepted to be housing ambassadors. They're not necessarily spread out all over. You know, they're probably mostly in the areas with the highest amount of business, so to speak. But I would hope that they would be helpful. And we do have people in another community board. I recently had a question asked about that, and I referred it to our marketing people, and I think there was a very quick and good response from the staff to that particular community board to look into and try to straighten out whatever the problem was. Other than that, there's not much I can say about that. Look, the Housing Connect process, first, as far as the income eligibility levels, again, the typical building that gets done through our program has a range, and the range is, like I said, generally from 30% to 80%, or maybe 100%. Obviously, some buildings have more units at some levels than at others. That depends on the cost. It depends on the location, on what the market is. You know, a lot of factors go into that. And the bottom line on all our projects is the numbers have to work. You know, when I say we act like a bank, you know, we're not going to use taxpayers' money on what we think is a risky situation that's not going to work. But you know, there are probably enough projects out there that there is some number of units available to people at all the different levels. Having said that, I'll go back to what I said before, that there's a huge response on every single building. I know one thing that you didn't say, but I'll point out, because I've heard it a lot, is that some people complain they never hear anything. And that may actually be true. Let's say that, again, let's say there's 100 apartments and there's 50,000 applications come in. And if you're number 45,000, you'll probably not hear anything, because it's just not going to get to you. So I don't want to say that the system is too successful in a critical way, because there is such a need. It shows what the need is, but there's just that reality. Was there another part, George, to the question?
No, I think that's good. I can follow up with Lisa on getting her a contact person within the agency. If she continues to have a problem, I'll reach out to you. The final, I guess the final question is maybe a statement in regards to, it comes from Regina Skeet. The area is becoming too congested. Please leave Boston Road alone. White Plains Road has already become a nightmare. Now, I guess we're looking at Boston Road. I've lived here since the 60s. The area has changed for the worse. When is enough development enough? And I guess this speaks to people's anxiety levels. Oh, there's more questions.
George, I'd like to hop in. Okay.
Oh, hold on. We're trying to get, so the next question comes from Beatrice Cornell. Who decided, you spoke to this, Ted, about the AMI being 30% as opposed to the net, which is the actual income end up with? And what can we do about how developers are taxed? It's ridiculous the amount of exemptions they can write off.
Okay, I'm not sure the first part of the question, but on the second part,
who decided why is it 30% of the who decided that?
When I first started working, I thought it was 25%.
I'm sorry, I just want to clarify the question.
30.
It's because you mentioned, Ted, that it's their tax for us with 30% of our gross income. That's not the actual income we come home with. So who decides that they're going to that it's enough, that 30% is what we should be, our rent should be?
Okay, again, that's not an HPD rule, so to speak. That's within the field of housing, you know, nationally, that is considered to be the standard. I think I said that probably some economists sometime way back decided that made sense, but it's not something that HPD just decided, okay, you know, that's what people should pay. And it's a problem, because in New York, you know, I don't think I mentioned, if you pay more than 30% of your gross income for rent and utilities, then you're considered rent burdened. And half the city is considered rent burdened. meaning that half the city is paying more than 30%, which is why we say that there's an affordable housing crisis, and why, and this goes into the density concerns that have been expressed today, that's why there's a feeling that it's just necessary to provide more housing, more permanent affordable housing all over the city, because there's a need. I mean, there's also, it's again, if there's a 100-unit building and 50,000 people are applying, again, then there is an affordable housing need.
Let me ask you this, Ted, in regards to that. Why is it that we use the federal metric rather than creating our own, for example? Are we required to, because we get money from the federal government for this housing or for these tax breaks?
Yes. There are various programs that are based on that, including the low-income housing tax credit, which again is the most commonly used tool for producing affordable housing across the country. That is based on this system, but I'll say again, it really doesn't matter, because we're not using the 100% as the eligibility level. We're using the percentages of it. The person who's making, I'm forgetting the numbers of myself now, let's say 20-something thousand, and so maybe they're like around 30% AMI or whatever it is. It's really meaningless to them that the metropolitan area AMI is 100%. That's 100% is whatever it is, because they're eligible for units at that level. Now, again, if we were using the 100% for eligibility, I would agree that that's a major problem, but we don't. And again, one of the things that we do when we do finance a project is we want to make sure that there's availability to people at those lower levels. I mean, you don't see in the Bronx us doing projects where everybody is over 100% AMI. That's just not going to happen.
Second part of her question was in regards to the tax exemptions that many of these developers receive. You spoke about the reason that they receive it is to entice them to build this affordable housing. But some of this stuff lasts for many, many years. Are we ever going to see revenue from many of these folks?
The word incentive is used for a reason, that it encourages people to do, because remember, we're giving the incentive so that they're providing affordable housing. I would agree, if somebody is building a building, maybe one of these super skyscrapers down in Midtown, I saw something yesterday that an apartment did something for $7 million. Well, I would certainly question what kind of incentives they're getting. But if we want people to provide housing where the monthly rent is $1,000, $2,000, then you have to provide incentives.
Okay. Lena dropped in the link. So I think that addresses our next question from Theodore James about the ambassador program, but he wanted to know what the role of the housing ambassadors and how can they be contacted. But they're site specific, right? I mean, for Riseboro, I think they reached out to somebody that in our district or is working with or has their main headquarters in our district.
You can look up on our website. And by the way, I didn't say this, I meant to. I strongly encourage people to look at our website. There is a tremendous amount of interesting and useful information on our website, www.nyc.gov/HPD. And then you just follow the prompts, for what you're interested in. I know there's a section on our website specifically on housing ambassadors. It lists each one by borough, and then has a link to their website. So yes, if you go into our website and you go for housing ambassadors, and then you go to the Bronx, you'll see the list, and then you can see which ones maybe are closer to your area.
I don't recall that. I did see that list because, again, we were working with Riseboro. I don't think the housing ambassador list, and you can correct me, Lena or Ted, it doesn't link to the projects that they're involved with, though, right? It just lists who they are.
But they're not connected to specific projects. They just cover general areas.
Okay. All right.
I mean, you could be theoretically, let's say you live in the Bronx and you want to apply to someplace in Brooklyn, you can still get help from the housing ambassador.
You call any housing ambassador in Brooklyn, they'll help you.
Or you can use the one in the Bronx, and what they'll help you is with the process.
Okay. Understood. All right, that Dr. Burke, that covers all the questions in the chat.
Okay, thank you. So I see Mr. Lanzano has his hand up again. So we've got about maybe another 5 minutes, and then I see Mr. Hall has his hand up. So those will be the last 2 questions. And then, okay, Ms. Clyde, let's see if I can get you in, Ms. Clyde, but we got to end it at noon. So we've got 3 questions. So I'm going to ask Mrs. Lanzano and Mr. Hall to make their questions quick. So Ms. Lanzano?
Okay, the implication of my question was that when we have the tipping capacity, aren't we already overpopulated? And Ms. Samo mentioned that if we had a vote, everybody would say no. If everybody would say no, then we should have a vote, because you're overruling the community for your own purposes. And I don't think that's correct. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Lanzano. Ms. Seymour?
So the question was really about the tipping point of population. Is that, Mr. Lanzano?
Yeah, I think it's something along those lines. I think what the gist of the statement was is that, you know, again, the community board, we have an advisory role, but, you know, the community knows what we want. So I think I'm just going to just wrap it up by saying this. I think that what Mr. Lanzano is saying is that, and I think Alfredo said this in his question, is that the community board should have more of a say so. So even though I know that, for instance, case in point, you guys are talking about Boston Road. The one thing that I've always proposed that our community board does, and the community as well, is think critically. So even though, as I've gotten to know you and Mr. Breed and your team, and same thing with Mr. Weinstein, you know, I know that you guys, and Manny too, so I know that you guys want the best for us, but I'm asking that we think critically for ourselves with your proposals, and not just because you say it that we vote for it, but we think about it critically and look at the long-term effects. And I think that's what Mr. Lanzano and Alfredo were saying in their question. So I'm going to tie it up because, like I said, we got to end this soon. So I've got Mr. Hall and I've got Ms. Claude, and then that'll be it. So Mr. Hall.
Okay. Listen. First of all, Ted Weinstein. I guess I'm out here on a day-to-day basis, and I see a lot of these developers or a lot of buildings being developed. And I'm getting ready to ask the same question. Instead of George Torres calling you, maybe as the housing chair, I need to call you every time a developer starts developing in this area, and they don't let the board know anything. It's quite problematic up here, quite a bit. All right. And before you answer that,
yeah. If I may just again, if they're not getting financing from us, there's no legal requirement that they contact you.
Okay, but if they are getting financing, then we can have a conversation. Is that correct?
If they are using our financing programs, they absolutely have to be contacting the board.
Okay, all right. Another thing, and I think Sean was talking when I chimed in. The Community Board 12 can dot their I's, they can cross their T's and everything, but if an elected official or the councilman does not like the direction things are going in, his conversation takes precedence over whatever the community board comes up with. If somebody can combat that, I'd like to hear them. But I've been doing this for a while, and I've seen this over and over again. So I just want to know, the elected officials' conversation can supersede what the community board comes up with in their own inquisition? Is that true or false, or where do we stand?
Sure, and I'm happy to address that specific question. And I think what you're referring to is that the formal land use review, the formal ULURP process, where the final vote does take place at City Council. You know, I think that is correct. The hope is, and we talked to some of this before, is that the coordination, you know, again, that we're having now in conversations like this, the coordination that happens during planning processes, that the community is advocating and working with the elected official, and that the elected official also when it enters formal review is seeing what the community board's opinion is on that. And so the hope is that, conversations have been happening long before anything enters into that formal review process, and that the elected official is engaged in those conversations and understands the community board's views. And that the community board's recommendation, and again, the borough presidents, city planning commissions, all are in front of that elected official. In the end, that you're right, that is where the final vote happens on a specific zoning change. But again, the hope is that we can strengthen and make sure that when we get to that result, it is reflective of all those previous conversations with the community board.
Okay. All right. Thank you. That's it, Dr. Burke. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Hall. Mrs. Clyde? Mrs. Clyde? Okay. Last time, Mrs. Clyde.
Can you hear me? Can you hear
Yes,
me
I
now?
can hear you now. Yes, yes.
Yeah. I'm sorry. The parking spaces at Riseboro are much less than the apartments themselves. So how will you determine how the parking spaces will be allotted? Or who gets parking space?
Ted, you want to go first?
Well, the general answer is that there is, for senior housing, they're not required to have parking. That's something that came into being a few years ago, and that's something that Carol could probably talk to more. But there is no legal requirement, and yet they are providing some parking, but not much. As far as how they're going to allocate that, that's really up to them. And then on top of the fact that there's no legal requirement, our experience, our senior program tells me, and the various organizations that do senior housing confirm it, that they have very little demand for parking in the senior buildings. Sometimes you might have somebody really willing to provide parking, but it's not required, and generally there wouldn't be in the senior buildings.
Okay.
George?
I'm not gonna fight with them.
George, you're muted.
I'm a pro and I still mute myself. I just wanted to raise my hand. So before you you close it out, just to say thank you to the city agencies and thank you to the folks that were part of this. I wish we would have had a greater showing, but you do have the hardcore board members on here. We're going to take this stuff, we're going to digest it. We're going to have some very serious conversations because you have people in the community that are represented, even on the board. We have differing opinions on how we move forward as a community. And I think that that's the most fascinating thing. And we want to work with everybody so that they feel like their voices are heard. So I'm just very appreciative. You came out a Saturday morning. Again, just thank you for all of that. Dr. Burke, back to you.
Well, thank you, sir. So it is noon, and so I'm going to wrap this up. So we did at least have 19 board members show up. And as you said, George, those are, the board members that we know that, we could count on. And again, so, I'll just leave that with there. But I would like to thank, because there's several things that I could, talk about. And I will talk with this about with HPD and with city planning separately. Because again, as I said, a lot of the questions that I've had, some were answered and some have been arisen. I will say to both of the borough directors is that, I'm sure George, as well as I, have been in communication with our new Councilman Riley, and I'm certain that we're going to be in conversation with Councilman Denowitz now that he's on board as well. So to discuss some of these things that we are discussing, one of the things that I can tell you right now is that I've asked our second vice chair, as well as Mrs. Keisha Lago Martin, to come up with proposals in which we can develop some of our own properties, a la city planning, that are in the MIH zones. And so there's some things that we want to see outside of it, and we'll talk about that separately. So I'm going to wrap this up. Again, our district manager said everything. Board members, thank you. Community members, thank you. And to the agencies, like I said, Ms. Seymour, Mr. Weinstein, and your teams for bringing this information to us. I'm hoping that it was very informative. I'm looking at the chat, and I'm looking at, look, most people enjoyed it. So again, thank you very, very much. And again, I look forward to maybe doing this at some time in the not too distant future. If there are more questions that arise, we'll make sure to get them to you, okay?
Thank you.
Not a problem. All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Have a great Saturday afternoon, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So George,
Thank you,
before we
George.
go- okay.
Thanks, everyone.
I'm trying to
Thank
stop
you.
this recording here so that we can record this. Hang on.
All right. Well, I was going to end the
I'm going
meeting.
to stop this recording here, George. You know, my computer is okay. There it is. I think I've got it. Okay. So stop
All right.
recording.
All right.